Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. Right! You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio!
Welcome, everyone, to I'm Nature. I'm your host, Brian Porter. In this week, I have somebody on that I actually don't know him all that well. I just saw a posting that he had done recently on the website called globalresearch.ca, an excellent site, by the way. His name is Professor Anthony J. Hall. He has a PhD in history, and he presently is a professor teaching at the University of Lethbridge. That's in Alberta, Canada. And his specialization is globalization studies. Good evening,
Hello.
Professor Hall. How you doing?
Very well, thanks, Brian. I got a little feedback. I don't know if that can be adjusted. I can hear myself reflecting back at myself. No, that's better. Okay, you've adjusted it. Hi.
Oh,
here we go.
Oh, right. Well, it's always the on-air sound check that's hard to do when you're off air.
Yeah.
But it tends to be a little more finicky, though. I think we have a good signal here. So I have all sorts of issues talking to people all over the planet. I have people from all over on my show, and a lot of people from Central America, actually, and there's some issues. Well, because I deal with a lot of people living in eco-villages, alternative lifestyles, they don't tend to have the best internet service, right? But you're living right in the city of Lethbridge?
That's good to get off the beaten track. Right now, I am in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. I'm in my study, talking to you through Skype, and looking forward to seeing what we're going to cover.
Yeah. I like I say, my show is often about Indigenous culture, Indigenous oppression, and I see you've written an excellent book on that very topic.
Well, that's my original field, Native Studies, as we called it at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. Then I moved here to Lethbridge to work in Native American Studies at the University of Lethbridge, and I did that for 20 years, and then I sort of broadened the framework and look at it in a global perspective, from a global perspective. And of course, the encounter between Indigenous peoples and various words could be used, colonialism, imperialism, the expansion of especially European powers throughout the world, certainly into the Americas, into Africa, parts of Asia. This is a huge phenomena that has defined many of the major issues that we're facing today, for instance, in the Middle East, where there's a lot of military conflict happening now, as we know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's certainly a big hotspot on the planet. Now, your book, The American Empire in the Fourth World, that was more to do with the fact that the doctrine of discovery, those sorts of issues, when basically the colonial powers from Europe came here and basically expropriated all of Turtle Island.
Well, Turtle Island, North America and Central America and South America, and of course this type of colonization involved major migration of peoples. India was colonized, but the majority of people in India are of Indian ancestry to this day, same in Africa, same in Asia, but it was different in the Americas, and it was different in Australia, where the Indigenous peoples were rendered a tiny minority. So I tend to frame my period of a major focus as 1492 to present. Let's say, from the Columbian conquest, from the era of, Christopher Columbus's initial voyage to today. And of course, that process of colonization is affecting most people on the planet today. Most people are on the receiving end of various forms of colonial, could I say, oppression. And so that phenomena, that historic phenomena, defines a lot of our relationships and tensions within our relationship, right to the present, of course.
Yeah, of course. And now we have a new type of. How do you see this huge immigration of Syrians, a lot of people from different cultures in the Middle East? How do you see that as another type of colonial kind of power, kind of consolidation of power, or how do you see that kind of movement?
Well, that's interesting, Brian. I was in the last few weeks in Germany, in Bavaria, and I got to see close up this phenomena of really millions of people suddenly being pointed towards Europe and sent into Europe. We are told, we have an impression that this is mostly people coming out of Syria and Iraq, the war-torn zone, uprooted people, and there is a good deal of that. But the largest migration seemed, from my perspective, from what I could see on the ground, to be from Africa south of the Sahara, from like Nigeria, from Senegal, from Ethiopia. There's also big migrations from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it's quite bizarre. It looks like a kind of organized trajectory aimed at destabilizing Europe, aimed at really making Europe very unstable. Inevitably there's going to be huge tensions. These groups being sent in are not easily assimilated, and they're not going through any regular system of seeking status as through immigration policies, meeting criteria. No, something very different is at play. So I do talk about the indigenous peoples of Europe. And Germany, of course, is, especially, could I say, hard hit by this kind of inexplicable just opening the borders. And how are all these people, how are they finding their way in? What is the process? This is all being financed, and there's a very coordinated effort, in different parts of the world to move people, to uproot people, and move them into Europe. And especially, it seems that Germany and Sweden are facing, very disproportionately large numbers of people. So I'm of the view that there is a malevolent impetus behind this. I don't blame the migrants themselves. I think they are being exploited and used. They're kind of being weaponized and put in a situation, in a very kind of dangerous and unstable situation. And so this, of course, who would be interested in destabilizing Germany? Who would want to do that? I noticed that the country of Israel does not have its borders open, and I don't see any advocates of idea that Israel should become multicultural and, open itself up to an array of different cultural influences. Like the case is being made by some in Europe that this is the thing to do in Europe. There is a history between Israel and what Israel embodies and where it comes from, and how history led up to the creation of Israel in 1948. It has a lot to do with what happened in World War II and really World War I, if we go back to the Balfour Declaration and the founding of the Jewish homeland by the British Empire in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So this relationship between Israel and Germany, and there's obviously a lot of associations there, wider constituencies involved. So since you raised the question of what's going on in Europe and colonization, I do see it as a kind of a plan to destabilize Europe. There was in the 1980s, Oded Yinon, an Israeli strategist, geopolitical strategist. He made it clear that the need of Israel was to divide and conquer, to create as much division in Israel's neighbors between different Islamic groups, between Christians and Muslims, ethnic differences, and to destabilize and dominate that region through divide and conquer. And I see that Oded Yinon plan being kind of expanded into Europe and an agenda to destabilize Europe.
Interesting. I've never heard of this person. It's also
Oded Yinon. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
To understand, how Israel relates to its neighbors and to the world, it's a very basic thing to read. Oded Yinon. Yinon.
Oh, okay. All right. And was he just was he a thinker, or was he involved in government?
Yeah, he's a geopolitical strategist proposing what Israel would have to do to thrive in the region, or at least dominate the region, deal with the animosities and antagonisms that were created because, of course, the creation of a new state in 1947, 1948, and the removal and the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous peoples, the Palestinians. Of course, this was a very dramatic transformation of the region. Of course, this all had behind it what is now the term has been taken up, the Holocaust term. And of course, we have this very tremendously adorned characterization of what happened between National Socialism and Jewish people in Europe. And there's a lot of controversy now. There's a lot of questioning and research coming to light what really did happen. And of course, there's an effort also to render it illegal to even discuss this subject of what happened. In any case, we know that out of that event, there was a kind of sense of Europe must do atonement, and Israel was created in 1948. 47, 48, out of this way that World War II was depicted. And it would seem that Zionists, in a sense, were among the key victors of World War II, and they took as their victory the creation of the new country of Israel, which displaced many indigenous peoples, and of course it's very harsh relations to this day. And of course this thing called the global war on terror, rooted in the events of 9/11, this kind of gives justification for a lot of the crimes against humanity that the Israeli government is committing these days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a lot of roads lead back to Israel.
Yeah, that's where we, somehow when you raise this question of colonization in Europe, what's going on, that got me going on that subject. But should we start where we started, or shall we go to the story that you identified and invited me on the show, the story of arrest Tony Blair, arrest George Bush? Of course, the Chilcot report came out, and so the idea that the law should apply to our heads of state, to those who are responsible for committing the really big crimes, the genocidal crimes, the crimes on the highest level, organized crime on the highest level, involving, organized armies and military forces, and the type of event that took place in Iraq in 2003 with Tony Blair, distorting information and lying and creating false premises for this invasion of Iraq, based on this phrase, weapons of mass destruction, and building up this this phantom. Of course, somehow the events of 9/11, September 11, 2001, were somehow finessed and massaged in the media, in the kind of lying, corrupt media, to somehow lead to the idea that Saddam Hussein was somehow responsible, and so that a focus on the need to enforce the rule of law, even on those at the highest end of our, chains of command. Presidents and prime ministers and generals and those in charge of large military forces. There is a cry rising up that Tony Blair should be arrested. He's been exposed as being involved in misleading the public, lying, misrepresenting the situation knowingly, and of course violating all the international laws. There was no UN approval for this invasion of Iraq in 2003, this invasion of Iraq, and of course the focus on arresting Tony Blair points to the reality that there is very little pressure coming from the public, especially in the United States, to arrest George Bush, who is, let's call him, a credibly accused war criminal. And of course, we got very interested, my friend and colleague, Splitting the Sky, he's a Mohawk activist. Splitting the Sky is a translation of his name, Duckajawiya, which is a given name, a Mohawk name. And so he attempted a citizen's arrest of George W. Bush in Calgary in 2009. George Bush was giving his first speech as a citizen, as a private citizen. He was no longer president of the United States. And he was being paid a large figure to come to the TELUS Center in Calgary and address a group of mostly, corporate people. And so we organized around that event, and eventually Splitting the Sky attempted a citizen's arrest of George W. Bush. He was, in the process, arrested himself. This created the basis for a trial, and the trial was actually against, the charges were being pressed against Splitting the Sky for what happened as he was meeting the police line and saying, do your job, police, and if you don't do your job, I guess we're going to have to do it. We, the citizens, are going to have to do it, because George W. Bush is a credibly accused war criminal. And we have laws in Canada and laws in the world against torture, against genocide, against aggressive warfare, is itself stated by the Nuremberg Tribunal to be, the supreme international crime. So how is it that we have the RCMP, protecting George Bush when they should be arresting George Bush? That we don't have any credible rule of law when it comes to the highest level of criminality. Of course, we'll see war crimes against some African despots, lower level heads of state, but we will never see legal proceedings against our own leaders. All we get is victor's justice. Nuremberg itself was a trial of the defeated side. Same with the Tokyo trials in relationship to the Japanese. We get trials having to do with the war in Yugoslavia, but again, it's the defeated side, Milosevic on trial. In the Rwandan situation, we won't look at both sides and the war crimes committed by both sides. We only look at the losing side, the Hutu side. We don't look at Paul Kagame, who's presently president of Rwanda and is responsible for a lot of the crimes against humanity taking place that did take place in 1994 in Rwanda, but are taking place to this day in the rush for spoils in eastern Congo. So this issue of needing to have some respect for the rule of law in our own countries, in Canada, for instance, Canada was not. It was passed in terms of the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, an actual domestic legislation in Canada. It was legislated that Canada is not to be a haven for war criminals. And H.W. Bush should be arrested too. That's his father, George H.W. Bush, but George W. Bush. Of course, George W. Bush was president of the United States on September 11, 2001, and the events of 9/11. I frankly look at George Bush as a kind of marginal player in the planning of 9/11. But 9/11, there's a huge movement of informed people who do our own, we do our own research, and we know 9/11 is not how it was interpreted for us. So that's among the things that George W. Bush should have faced, criminal proceedings for, and still should face criminal proceedings. And so I was writing about that in 2010, and I simply brought an article I'd written forward because there was in the news a lot of discussion about arresting Tony Blair. And it seems like it's dying down. And after the Chilcot inquiry, 15 years, almost 15 years after the event, we finally get some kind of report. And yes, sure enough, it's really clear that he broke many laws. And so where is the determination of our law enforcement, our totally corrupted law enforcement, who don't really enforce the law on the highest level? The law is to be enforced on poor people, on homeless people, maybe on protesters. Law can be, quite ruthless, and it's not really law. Police become a kind of political force under the political control of political masters. The RCMP, to my way of thinking, doesn't come close to being a law enforcement agency anymore. It's clearly a politically, a political agency to enforce the political agenda of those at the top of the pyramid of our, thoroughly corrupted and discredited governmental systems. And of course, the leaders that we elect really are not the highest echelons of the decision makers. The leaders that we elect, and we don't really have much choice in the way that there's certain positions that if you're going to have a chance to be elected and get positive coverage in the media, you must not, for instance, look at 9/11. And of course, we could see in 2014 when Gaza was being invaded by the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, and we're seeing these tragic pictures of children being obliterated, blown apart. We could see citizens in that hellhole of a concentration camp called Gaza, which remains a very dark place. I don't, to imagine putting people in a concentration camp and then bombing them and ruining their infrastructure and of course blockading them and taking complete control of everything that comes in and out. But remember, in 2014, not one party, not one parliamentarian in Canada would raise a voice to say anything other than Israel is the victim. Israel, these little rockets that are being fired. Who knows what the real background to this is? But of course, this was depicted. The line we heard again and again is, "This is Israel doing self-defense. This is Israel doing self-defense." Well, what about the rights of self-defense of the indigenous peoples, the Palestinians? This is a subject that Splitting the Sky would often talk about, the right of self-defense. What about the right of self-defense of indigenous peoples in North America? We came into our communion as a result of a article I wrote in the Globe and Mail about the Indian War in British Columbia in 1995. Around Gustavson Lake. And after I wrote that article, Splitting the Sky came to see me. And he turns out he's got a fascinating story. He spent much of his life in prison. He was charged in 1971 with murdering a guard in the Attica prison event. Attica, federal U.S. prison in Upper New York State around Buffalo. There were 43 people killed in that most notorious event in the prison history of the United States. The inmates famously took control of the prison, took hostages, and then when Nelson Rockefeller, then governor of New York, took the prison back, took back control of the prison, many of the inmates were gunned down, were kind of assassinated in firing squad type situations. 43 people died. One person was charged. That person was Sacagawea, Splitting the Sky, John Boncour. He goes by different names. He was 19 at the time, and so his case, it was a very famous case. Kunstler was his lawyer for a time, and then Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States, he became lawyer for Splitting the Sky. And Splitting the Sky made it clear that he would have died in prison if it hadn't been for the intervention, the legal advice and intervention of a former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, a very controversial jurist. Anyway, when it came to the trial, it was a trial directed at, criminalizing Splitting the Sky, but we called it Splitting the Sky versus George W. Bush. And it is, I think, a pioneering effort to create jurisprudence, to get some focus in the legal system on the need to enforce the law on our own war criminals, or should I say credibly accused war criminals, because we still have the principle that you're innocent until proven guilty. Of course, since 9/11, that principle has been violated, and people are tortured left and right to create false evidence for this phony, specious global war on terror, this psychological operation. So, many people the world over, we've kind of thrown away this principle that you're innocent until proven guilty. But I think if we were to do proper war crimes tribunals on, say, Tony Blair or George W. Bush or Stephen Harper or Barack Obama, nothing was reversed. The militarism just was ramped up during the two-term presidency of Barack Obama. So the people who represent us in parliaments and such, they are, they've got blood on their hands, huge amounts of blood on their hands. The aura of criminality is all over them. But it seems, if you who's the philosophers that said, if you kill one or two or three people, of course you're going to get in trouble. But if you kill 10,000 people, maybe you'll become a national hero and they'll put up a statue for you. But these grotesque military operations around the world directed primarily at Muslims, millions and millions of Muslims, civilians, people who had nothing to do with 9/11 or anything like that, have been demonized and made the targets of war crimes against humanity, all framed in this specious language created since 9/11 of this global war on terror, these lies, these constant stream of false flag events. Whether it be in Nice or in Orlando or San Bernardino or Paris or Dhaka in Bangladesh, there's a very significant body of literature and research talking about, the stream of false flag events that we're facing, and that are being engineered to keep this hatred of Muslims alive, and develop this alternative to the Cold War. The Cold War, once the old enemy, the Soviet Union, was no longer existent. And what would the military-industrial complex do? There was a need for a new enemy. And I would say that the Zio-American imperial forces, they more or less introduced the new enemy and groomed the new enemy and engineered the new enemy so that the military-industrial complex, could keep going, in fact, expand its operations after the Cold War. The anti-communist machinations of the Cold War were transformed into supposedly anti-terrorist machinations. The same sort of establishment kept in power, the same pyramidal structure of command and control. And the main agency that kind of provided the new enemy, especially Israel First Americans, who organized in the Project for the New American Century, they have created this new paradigm, and of course it requires, I guess, these false flag events, these engineered, concocted events. The Islamic State, who's financing it, who organizes it, who provides the armaments, who provides the administrative know-how, the way that the media is played and spun. We need to look at the roots of this, and we know it goes back to the United States. We know it goes back to the CIA. We know it goes back to Saudi Arabia. We know it goes back to Mossad and Israel. But anyway, I'm covering a lot of ground here, but I've thrown a lot out there, and give you some idea of what we might talk about. It's your call. What do you want to pick up?
Well, I wanted to just explore a little longer this attempt to arrest George Bush when he was in Canada. Was it 2009 when this?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So your friend Splitting the Sky actually went up to George Bush or tried to arrest him, and then he himself got arrested for trying to arrest George Bush?
Well, there was a lot more to it than that. Let me just back up to maybe 60 days before George Bush landed in Calgary. Splitting the Sky called me. He's passed away for 3 years now, but he called me, and he was then living in Chase, BC, with his wife and family, and said, George Bush is coming into Calgary and we've got to do something. It was kind of a strange phenomena. We didn't choose for this to happen, but here is this notorious figure, George Bush, coming into the local territory. Lethbridge is not too far from Calgary. It's to the south of Calgary, where I am right now. I'm about 110 miles from Calgary. So there was quite a lot of organization to prepare a demonstration of sorts to indicate that George Bush was not welcomed. And really the key to it, and it was misrepresented in the media, like we just don't like George Bush and we're demonstrating against George Bush. No, I mean, the key to it was to put pressure on law enforcement officials to actually do their job, and to live up to the premise that Canada is not to be a refuge for war criminals, and to to arrest George Bush and take him to The Hague and invoke the law enforcement procedures that are on paper against Bush and, Cheney and Rice. I mean, many people in his cabinet would, be similarly subject to war crimes proceedings if we had a real rule of law, not a fake rule of law just expediently used by those in power to promote their political agendas. There was, several hundred people outside the TELUS Convention Center. There was a long lineup of people waiting to go into the convention center, the TELUS Center in downtown Calgary. And in amidst the, people holding placards and chanting and this kind of thing, Splitting the Sky was quite excited. He came up to me and said, "I think I can make it through." He was with a cinematographer, Nathan Moulton, and he are you there?
Oh, I'm still here. Yeah.
Yeah. And he there's a funny noise coming through. And anyway, he went up to this is all on tape. You can look at it on YouTube, arrest George Bush, Splitting the Sky. It would come up. It's quite a famous YouTube. And he says to the police, we've given you the information. We'd been working with Lawyers Against War, Gail Davidson. We developed evidence. We developed documentation. We'd given it to the RCMP, not just Splitting the Sky and I. Many people were involved, and some people had a history of in earlier events when George Bush came to Canada as president. There was Michael Mandel, for instance, a law professor at Osgood. He was involved with Lawyers Against War, and so this sort of symbolic effort by Splitting the Sky was a kind of culmination of doing due diligence. 3 weeks before the event, I'd given a presentation at the University of Winnipeg, and the paper was entitled "Bush League Justice: Should George W. Bush be Arrested in Calgary, Alberta, and Charged with International Crimes?" And that paper went viral. It was on Global Research CA, on VoltaireNet, on many websites, and it was quite prominently played. The news of this, what was in that article was prominently played in France. Interestingly, it was kind of covered up in Alberta by our, corrupt media like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, for instance, who is pretty much, just like the RCMP, a crown corporation that has lost any sense of doing its mission, has been so harnessed to a particular political agenda coming from very elite and powerful sources that the CBC cannot be trusted. They're not a credible news agency anymore. So in any case, I'm telling a story. So it's quite.
No, well, you put a lot of work into this. It wasn't just like a very kind of like a sort of short effort. You coordinated. You wrote a paper on it. You got a lot of other people.
Well, writing a paper is one aspect of it. Then I went. So once the case was in the books, so Splitting the Sky was charged. It's very interesting. He was he was smashed down on the ground, and of course there were snipers all on top of the buildings, tasers all over the place. George Bush had his own personal, private security agency with him. There was every type of, police agency and secret agency, and of course, what is this is a U.S. person. He's just a private citizen. He's not president anymore, but he's got his, his business contacts, who, with all their security agencies, so-called security agencies. So it was interesting to see Splitting the Sky, slam down onto the ground. He was like 60 years old in that period. and flipped over like a pancake. And they put when you put things around your wrists, what do they call those things? When they tie your wrists together.
Yeah,
Yeah, and anyway, so it was quite a moment. Handcuffs, and it was quite a moment to see him. He was winded. He gets up. He regathers his poise. And of course, it's a moment that some people might feel a little intimidated or overwhelmed, but he's a brave man, and he looks out and he just says very clearly several times, "Arrest George Bush, not me. Arrest George Bush, not me." And then he is taken over, and then the audience it is kind of like an audience, but the protesters, the people watching this, start to become very incensed, and you can see the police are worried that there may be a kind of situation that they can't control, so they pull out their different types of weapons and become very kind of aggressive. And Splitting the Sky is taken over to the police van. It's like maybe 100-yard walk, and he's quite defiant, through the whole period of being transported. And then they put him in a paddy wagon, and then a man in an orange jacket comes out, who's a plant. And of course, he arranges it so that the media take pictures of him. And he's just saying sort of nonsense. "I don't like George Bush," and all the papers the next day had him on the cover as the sort of representative protester. And this was obviously set up. I spent the night in the threshold where the jail is, because I didn't want it to be possible that maybe the next day they say, "Oh, he hung himself," or that it was important to get close to it. I understand Ramsey Clark, his lawyer and former Attorney General of the United States, called the police station several times, so to get him through that night when he's in custody, the strange things can happen through the night in prisons, and of course nowadays all these so-called terrorist events, almost always the patsy or the person blamed for the killing is killed in the process, and so there's no trial, there's no testimony from that person. So anyway, Splitting the Sky went through
all these events. Sorry, just to get this.
Yeah.
There's never any. These people must be leaving scads of information, notes to explain why they're doing these dramatic things. It never ever gets into the media.
Well, these are often patsies, or people who are played. I don't know if you know of Trevor Aronson's book called The Terror Factory. He looked at about 500 cases where the FBI says, look, we apprehended a Muslim terrorist. And of course, they're almost all, like 98%, the FBI is playing the person. They're trying to identify unstable people who maybe have addictions problems, psychological problems, legal problems, people who are vulnerable one way or another, and then play them and engineer these cases. So that's a bit of a deviation to Splitting the Sky. Got through the night. He came back, and actually I drove him back to Lethbridge, and he spoke the next day in my class and related, this history-making event in class. So then there is the trial itself coming up in Calgary, and I went to Paris to a 9/11 event, Vers la Vérité, and my intention was to connect with Cynthia McKinney. And Cynthia McKinney has served several terms in the U.S. Congress. She's a Black woman, and she famously asked Donald Rumsfeld questions about 9/11, questions about the missing $2.3 trillion. She explained how Rahm Emanuel did the gerrymandering to get her out of Congress. in any case, I met her in Paris, and so she kind of embodies the history in the United States that gave rise to the existence of Martin Luther King, and the politics of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, and Splitting the Sky through his history in the U.S. prison system was very much sort of embraced by the American Indian movement. So let's say the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement are meeting in this matter. And so, we did have a very historic event where Cynthia McKinney and myself and Splitting the Sky reflected on this trial that was unfolding. And when the trial did unfold, my paper on Bush League justice, should George W. Bush be arrested in Calgary, Alberta, and tried for international crimes, that did get into the exhibits of the trial. So we can say that in Calgary, we were able to start the process that should be resulting right now in criminal charges against Tony Blair. And, this would be a moment with the Chilcot inquiry having just reported, to see that we deal with something. But of course, we don't deal with anything because we have such a corrupt system, a media that does not give all sides of the story, that does not allow fundamental key interpretations of what is really happening to get any reflection. And of course, people end up, coming to shows like this, and we do find that we are able to communicate to some of a fairly significant audience. But how can we get from the point of sort of complaining about what we're seeing and all the improprieties and criminalities and the tortures and the lies and the defrauding of the public and the weaponizing air with chemtrails and water with forced fluoridation and food with GMOs. I mean, we're just contending with so many things, and it's so hard to get any focus on these big mass media organs. So we do so in the way we're doing. So Cynthia McKinney did come in for the trial, and she did speak. You can, if you looked up Cynthia McKinney meets Splitting the Sky, there's a series of about 10 videos. I held the camera myself. We also live streamed it. It was a very historic event during the trial of Splitting the Sky, anyway, so that was the initiative. The article that you saw, I was just trying to draw together some of the links and point out, where you could look for the different documentation on this. So I was happy to see in describing this show that you said I'm still, trying to arrest or see that George Bush, meets the criminal justice system as he should do. He's a credibly accused war criminal. I'm not going to say he's guilty, but the evidence is there. But I would stick to the principle that we should hear his defense. He should have an opportunity to defend himself. Especially Dick Cheney, the same thing. Like he's very much involved, much more involved than George Bush in 9/11. Cheney was at the controls of the military industrial complex in the White House bunker on the morning of 9/11. We still don't really know what happened in the bunker. Mineta, the transport minister, has an account of what happened there, totally different than Cheney's account. So this idea that these are outstanding issues, and as long as heads of state have the knowledge that they're protected, that they're not going to be held accountable for their infractions of the laws and the international laws and the treaties and the conventions against, torture, against the guarantees of freedom of expression and human rights and all of these violations against these fundamental principles that societies that we once imagined to be somewhat free and democratic. I don't think anybody could be under the illusion we live in free and democratic societies anymore. But if we are ever going to get back to any kind of decency, viability of our societies to actually produce viable lives and stable environments where human beings can thrive, and not just have to spend all our time, for instance, trying to protect ourselves from being poisoned by these unregulated food companies or fluoridation companies or surveillance and spying companies, or these companies that organize these false flag terror events. There should almost be a special stock market, I would say, for all the companies that are getting involved. We used to be able to say the CIA or Mossad, and there would be clear institutional boundaries to these agencies doing these dark, secret things. But of course, it's so much of it has been privatized, has been contracted out to the private sector. Edward Snowden wasn't working for the CIA. He was working for Booz Hamilton, a big company that does these so-called security contracts. So this concept of having some legal accountability from people on our own side who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. And of course, one of the great crimes is what happened on 9/11. And of course, the blame is all pointing towards Islamic jihadists said to be acting alone out of no other motivation than religious zealotry and sort of visceral hatred of the West. This is a fantasy. This has been created, and now it is to some extent coming true because it's being funded and built up. The Islamic State is an outgrowth of a long period of this process.
Well, we're coming up to a break, Professor. So we'll pick this up after the break, folks. Welcome back to I'm Nature. I'm your host, Brian Porter. A very fascinating guest on with me this week, Professor Hall, expert in the history of, I'd say, militarism and colonialism. He's extremely articulate. But before we get back to Professor Hall, I'd like to put in my plug for the station, Revolution Radio, one of the best places, I think, on your radio dial or on the internet for accurate information on what's really going on this planet, be it political, religious, spiritual, news, or information. So please support Revolution Radio. Buy some seeds, perhaps subscribe to the archive, which I believe is an incredible deal for $5 a month, 90 shows that can be all downloaded. Of course, I have a podcast for my show under I Am Nature on YouTube. But there's 90 shows there in the archive, and it's extremely important that we support this station. So we're going to get back to Professor Hall now. I just want to confirm that he's back with us.
Here I am.
All right.
There's that feedback again.
Maybe it just starts at the beginning.
Yeah. No, it's faded away.
Yeah, just... Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, well, yeah, you pulled a lot of different things together, a lot of scenarios. Yeah, you started with hinting at the notion of some sort of solution to this problem of these megamaniacal world leaders seemingly getting away with genocide. And it's a very difficult thing to solve because I've recently been introduced to the sovereign movement, actually ever since I became a host on Revolution Radio about 16 months ago. There's quite a few people on the station who are into the sovereign movement, and basically the premise of the sovereign movement is that there really isn't any justice within the present legal system. So those that the best protected are the ones that are at the top who designed this thing, and it goes back to the ages of Babylon, right? So it's very difficult to exact any sort of justice, especially against the elite, because sovereign means you're basically above the law.
Yeah, well, of course, sovereign, are we talking about a sovereign nation? I think you're talking about a sovereign individual. So what do we make of, the existing structure of sovereigns that we inherited from history, going back to, well, especially the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, I know the emergence of the Netherlands from the Spanish Empire. I mean, there was a lot of history around this. So sovereigns, we had sovereign monarchs. Canada is still governed by a sovereign monarch, and we have a parliamentary democracy, supposedly not working very well. And
you see, the sovereign part comes into the fact that the RCMP actually, and so do the provincial police, they pledge an oath to the Queen, right? So they're not really there to protect us as much as they are to protect her interests. You see, this is where it all sort of comes together. This analytical framework, and I've got some people who really understand the history of law and where it all came from, and it's just a fascinating story to I don't know if you're familiar of the intricacies of this legal system, the fact that they came to North America or Turtle Island and they took the law of the sea and they applied it to the land as a way of stealing all the land from the natives and justifying their genocide. So it's a very powerful framework, and I think it helps explain a lot about why it's very difficult to prosecute people who are basically saying that we make the law, so you cannot prosecute us under our own law.
Well, there are laws on the books that sure we could prosecute George W. Bush or Stephen Harper or Barack Obama. Sure, there is all kinds of written law and supposedly the enforcement mechanisms, but we also have politics. And the fact that, the rule of law is supposed to be kind of blind, and it applies irrespective of one's position in society and one's political prestige or influence. That's not the case. Now, this idea that maritime law ends up being applied on land, I suppose the history of the East India Company would well exemplify the history of this phenomena that you're talking about. Think back to the days when the Spanish are raping and pillaging the Aztec country, the Mayan country, the Incan country. They're taking out loot, gold, and silver by the ton. And as things unfold in that part of the world, they begin to enslave Indians and bring out silver from, for instance, Potosi in what's now Bolivia. And so these galleons full of these riches are going across the ocean, and English pirates capture some of these galleons. And we all know the story of pirates and piracy, and we watch Peter Pan, and we grow up kind of having this kind of affectionate attitude to pirates, these people who were on the high seas and thought nothing of killing numbers of people and taking control of their riches. But these riches, of course, were stolen and plundered in the first place from the indigenous peoples who were being genocided. There's Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s, watching this process. And she's got different friends, pirate friends, or Francis Drake being one of them. And she gives a charter saying, you're no longer a pirate, you're a privateer. And as long as you give us a piece of the action, a percentage of what you capture from these Spanish galleons full of gold and silver, you can keep a percentage of it, and we the monarch and the royal family, and we'll get our percentage. And so that's how it worked. And if this could work on the high seas, why not apply it also to land? And so both this new polity, the Netherlands, and this emerging polity, England, they latch on to India, which is tremendously rich. There's lots of minerals and all kinds of riches coming out of India. And the East India Company is created by a royal charter. And once that becomes so successful, and it's proven how much wealth can be plundered and taken out of India, then we have different expressions of that. So the Hudson's Bay Company, created in 1670 by for a time the monarch was removed by Cromwell and others and other Puritans in a civil war in England, and then the monarchy was restored, and James II, created the Hudson's Bay Company, and created a new polity called Pennsylvania, and gave out royal charters for slaving and such. So, from the inception of these imperial and colonial patterns, it's largely private companies being empowered by governments to do the kind of dirty work of imperialism and colonialism. And that is the pattern to this day. So anyway, there's a little bit of historical reflection. We could talk about the monarchy in Canadian terms, living next to the United States. As I grew up, imagining Canada being some kind of idyllic place, a place of great potential. It was necessary, and it is necessary, if we want to develop Canada's potential, to not simply be a colony of the United States. And Canada, developed as a colony of Great Britain. But in the 20th century, especially, Canada very much became an economic and cultural colony of the United States. So the idea of a sovereign Canada that could provide a good way of life for Canadians, for our own people, this is something I had hoped for. I went into Canadian history. I tried to study with a view to bringing knowledge to the service of an edified sovereign Canada. Now, of course, I think the way you're talking about sovereignty, it's conceiving of individuals as being sovereign. And, it's becoming clear that we do need to find ways to get out of the dominant political economy and groups of people to come together and do barter and different ways of, self-sufficiency. But I must say I haven't given up entirely on the ideal of a sovereign Canada. And of course, given the history of the American Revolution, the Civil War in British North America, and the secessionist movement succeeded and created a republic, created the United States of America. And the rhetoric was to get rid of the monarchy and become a people's democracy. But it didn't work out very well, did it? The United States is the internal problems, I think, structured right within that republic from its founding, are really showing the weakness of that society, which is on a fast decline, and of course taking Canada with it in some ways.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, you see, the interesting thing about is the sovereign movement is not just about individual. Like you are right, it's I have friends, and we're looking at developing sovereign communities, not just individuals. There's something called an alloidial trust, which allows people to actually own their own land. There's actually legal procedures that can help even Indigenous people to reclaim their land. So this is just something new that I've discovered over the last few months. I'm continuing to explore it, but I'd love to get you on. I try to get my friend David William, who's an expert in these issues. He's been studying natural law versus the maritime law, the doctrine of discovery, all these horrible, corrupted legal systems, the Bar Association, all these all these entities. The natural law is very simple, and I think it's to the point. It says you basically have the right to a trial amongst your peers if someone accuses you of harming someone. That's the basis of law, natural law. There's harm involved, but we have a whole bureaucracy now of people being fined for doing minor little things like exceeding a speed limit, and we have all this incredible bureaucracy which enslaves us. Licensing for everything. Pretty soon we're gonna have to pay to walk across the street. This is what the governments are doing to us. So it's all this bureaucracy that's really leading a lot of people to say, hey, there's something really wrong with our society. I mean, I can barely breathe anymore without paying for it. And according to the people that I know who have very good connections with, actually, believe it or not, there's a rebel Rothschild, and he's helping people to develop sovereign communities. It's quite hard to believe, but I have very good connections with people who work with these people, or this one Rothschild member who's, according to him, the whole world is within a Rothschild trust, illegally owned by the Rothschild. It's like I say, I'd love to get you in conversation with these people because it's quite. I like to engage in comparative analysis on things, and I find their thesis to be very, very convincing. But I'm not a professor of history like you are, so I'd love to listen to the discussion that would ensue by comparing your perspectives on history and law, those sorts of things. I think it would be very constructive.
Well, one thing I could assert in relationship to private property in Turtle Island, the power of this idea of private property is enormous. Think about how we structure land title. Think about the stock market. Think about the futures markets. Think about the ways that mortgages are developed and insurance is developed, and the way we commodify our universe, our world, our land, our resources. To me, this idea of private property has almost got out of control, and it's a very peculiar concept. I mean, when you think about I don't know, the buffalo herds in this part of the world where I am right now, and the Blackfoot people, there was no idea that let's go and get some buffalo and then we'll bring it into the community and we'll say, 98 cents a pound. Everybody, who's got enough money to buy the food, get in line here, and we'll commodify this dead buffalo. And no, I mean, you feed the old people, you feed the children. Not everybody is in a position to hunt the buffalo. You share. I mean, do they own the range that they're on? Do the various birds and insects, do they own the land where they're living, their habitat? So this idea that the land can be subjected to this private property system, and once you've got the deed, you just put up the fence and then anything goes. No, to me, this is not in conformity with nature. And this show, I think, is about trying to live in conformity with nature. Not only that, but when you talk about individuals or groups asserting their private ownership of a community land and then becoming sovereign. Well, what about the underlying agreements already made with Indigenous peoples, the treaties between the Crown and the Indigenous peoples? And doesn't this put some limitations on what can happen to the land? Say a Chinese tar sands company wants to treat territory as if it's just theirs. Once they pay for it, then you can do anything with it. Look at the mess has been made of so much of this beautiful, pristine territory, Alberta. What gave those private companies the imperative, the authority to do what was done with, our sacred waters, our blessed clean waters, to use these waters, to use 3 or 4 barrels of fresh water for every barrel of bitumen. So this issue of how to conceive of property and how to bring ourselves in relationship to property. Of course, there is private property in the Aboriginal world, maybe names, maybe teepee designs, horses. I'm told that in Blackfoot country here, a lot of the wealth would be measured in horses. There's a family in this area called Many Gray Horses, and the elder of that family, the person who was first named by the missionary and given the personal name, then becomes a Christian name, a family name, and it's passed through the male line in the Christian model. I mean, this is fairly recent that this has happened here, but the names point to the different ways that you can conceive of property. The potlatch would be sharing your property, the West Coast potlatch. But in sharing the property, there would be recognition of different titles, different, in the seeding plan in the potlatch, the way people were seeded, put in relationship to one another, the way they were configured in the longhouses. I mean, this would have a whole symbolic importance about how to structure society, and a lot of the decision making was actually happening through the distribution of wealth and the redistribution of wealth. And as this wealth is being distributed through gifts, through presents, and presents are not only material things, they may be songs, they might be names, that this is the way the Constitution is structured. This is the way life is organized. And of course, the missionaries, they outlawed the potlatch and they outlawed the Sundance because they could see how important these institutions were in keeping the traditional culture alive. And the object of this form of colonization was to break up the societies and to uproot the societies and to assimilate individuals into the colonial societies, and that's what the boarding schools were built for. So how do we conceive of property? And it seems to me this idea of private property is really well developed. And of course, we have a tiny group who claim, the vast majority of the property, like 62 individuals owning, more than half the wealth of everything to be owned, more than the bottom half of humanity, the 4 billion at the bottom half of humanity, have less wealth collectively than the 62 people. Then when we get into the Rothschilds and this whole system of central private banks, and the fact that no alternative is allowed, and those who try to do alternatives, like Saddam Hussein, in saying we're going to use euros, not American dollars, in oil transactions, or Muammar Gaddafi, who is trying to have an African-based, a pan-African-based money system, a gold-based money system, the dinar. And Iran, of course, is not subject to the Rothschild system of central banks. So this question of how we're going to deal with the the dominant political economy on Earth, which is obviously, poisonous to the renewal of life on this Earth, and is not sustainable, and creates this insane system where the vast majority of people are plunged into indebtedness and thus enslaved to further empower a tiny cabal who claim ownership of so much proprietary interest. And there is a particular banking family, the Rothschilds, that when it comes to saying, who are the wealthiest people on Earth, I mean, there's always, nobody knows what to do exactly with the Rothschilds, because, do they have trillions? Is it, how many hundreds of trillions? Is it, how much of the wealth is centered in a family that has been very astute in financing war over generations? And of course, the original hedge fund is to fund both sides in war. And so whatever the outcome is, you sort of have a guarantee. This war on terror, the global war on terror, I mean, the same people who are fighting the Islamic State are funding the U.S., NATO powers to arm themselves. Arming both sides in conflicts is very much happening right now. And of course, the harvest for this system of central banking, the ultimate harvest is warfare. And we have now no viable peace movement. This whole confusion around 9/11 and the misrepresentation from the first minutes of 9/11, where Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel, goes on BBC and immediately starts to talk about a war on terror, a concerted war on terror, and names Osama bin Laden, and lays out basically the whole trajectory of the world that exists now today in a sort of an illusion, giving license for this military operation, this military juggernaut to do its dastardly deeds among us. I mean, this was introduced on 9/11 even before the Twin Towers fell. There was Ehud Barak, just happened to be in the London studio, just happened to be ready to present this full-fledged interpretation. So these myths, these religious fables supporting this system of ruthless, rapacious militarism, who has as its focus is what's going on in the Middle East, and right now Syria is at the center of it. Isn't it interesting that the Islamic State is doing lots of damage towards other Islamic people? And of course, some would say they're not Islamic; it's a proxy army. But isn't it interesting that there is never any direction of hostility towards Israel, although they're right in the region? And in fact, it's on a matter of record that Islamic State fighters will go to Israel for hospitalization, for health care. And of course, there's Turkey, buying the oil from the Islamic State, supposedly our ally, the NATO ally of Turkey, buying oil from the Islamic State and then presumably feeding that oil throughout the European Union. So this is a bit of a rant, I suppose, on how to think about property, finance, economics, and such.
Yeah, no, I understand. I have a very, very simple solution to a lot of these issues, and that's why I called my show I'm Nature. Basically, it's very simple to understand the way we're supposed to live here. First of all, we know we're a natural being because 90% of the cells in our body are from outside of us. They're microbial. They're found in other places in nature. They're absolutely essential for our survival. So we're actually more nature than we are human. Uniquely, we're more nature than human. And actually,
you mean our gut? Are you talking about our gut and all the organisms that live inside of us to help us digest our food and such?
Yes, yes. And by a cell count number, we have more microbes than we actually have our own cells. It's an incredible, and they're everywhere in the body. They're not just in our guts, in our intestines. They're actually all over our bodies. And I think that they actually do all sorts of beneficial things that we don't quite understand. So we know we're a natural being. So if we know that, well, where do we fit into this natural?
We're a whole ecological system.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're part of nature. We're a big part of it. So when we look at the different ways of different animals and how they live in nature, I think we're most closely associated with a pack animal. We seem to like being together. We're not solitary creatures. We seem to have this desire to be in families, and then families of families or communities. The problem is that what's happened is that we've decided to create huge communities where there are very few people in charge. So the real solution is to break down these huge communities into small communities. If you want to have a democracy where people actually have a say in some power and some decision-making abilities, and most crucially, understand what the hell's going on in your little community, who's got the dough, where are the resources and whatnot, versus this whole a matrix of deception we're dealing with. You have to understand, you have to know the players. So you have to have a small community if you know who you're dealing with. So the natural community for us is the smaller community. And how small should it be? Well, that's a big question.
Small is beautiful. Small is beautiful is the name of that famous book.
Yeah.
60s, I guess.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book, and I don't know.
Schumpeter.
Schopenhauer or something. Yeah, beautiful book. I think there's a huge theme in that, and I think it forms the basis of how we should be living. And I also associate it very closely with the Indigenous wisdom and their traditions, because when they got too big, a tribe, they would form another clan. And you see, this is keeping with the same thing, that people can only manage to live in a society that's only so large as to give their voice some weight in the community. Once it gets too big and your voice becomes unacknowledged and unimportant, or there's just no room, there's no time to listen to your view or your concern, then that community is too big. And I think this was the natural wisdom of the Native people, and this is why they kept breaking into smaller and smaller groups, or groups as they added to their population. They created more clans, and there's beautiful structure. And this I connect this with the sovereign movement. What we want to do is try to create more and more communities of people who can claim legally that they are independent. It's not so much an ownership issue; it's more an issue of having the ability to make your own laws, create your own system, and of course, it's all going to be based on nature growing. It's local production of food, energy, housing. This is the core of all the eco-village movement. There's a huge movement in the world now. Oh, well, huge. Probably, maybe 10,000 eco-villages, last count, on the planet. They're not all off the grid, but a lot of them are moving in that direction. So it's an understanding, it's a consciousness raising and awareness in people that, hey, we've gotten too big. Let's look at Iceland within the general, polity structure or geopolitics now. Here's a small country that actually dealt well with the banking problems of 2008, and they actually imprisoned some of their bankers. I don't think they paid off the derivatives that were thrown at them that they didn't understand. So a small group of people with a fairly decent media who explained the situation, and because it was a smaller country, it survived much better. So that fits into the same sort of motif and analytic that I'm presenting. That smaller groups of people have a much better chance of forming a society with some justice and some basic understanding of how we should be living.
That's surely got a lot of wisdom. We also need to reflect on the need for confederacy building and new types of configurations of distinct communities. What will we call them? Sovereign communities, very ecological, self-sufficient communities. But of course, trade is often a good thing if it's done in a respectful, reciprocal manner. If it's not exploitative, all parties in a transaction are respected and dealt with fairly, it can be beneficial. When I think of these Central American societies, we might reflect in Canada on life in the Canadian Shield and very small communities, but last year I was in Peru and witnessed these Incan societies in the Andes, where there was a great proliferation of food, crops, potatoes especially, and these Central American societies, corn, beans, and squash, and tomatoes, and peppers, and chocolate, and a huge part of the food, the contemporary foods of the world, come from these societies, and they had fairly large scale organizations, and what I found extremely impressive about looking at the way the Aztecs set themselves up was the importance put on drainage, put on water, and to see these societies built on the peaks of mountains and up and down these huge slopes with terraces, and so there's obviously a great deal of organization happening, and large numbers of people working in such a way that the result was a kind of harmonious relationship between food production, agriculture, large-scale agriculture done in a very sort of small-scale way. I mean, the two were able to coexist. So yes, we need to sort of go back to basics and realize the human condition, our mentality. It's very difficult to live in societies with millions and millions of people around you. You rarely see anybody in some of these urban environments if you're moving away from your little home base in an urban center. Nevertheless, we do have this infrastructure. We do have our life support system are based on these grids, and yes, we need to get away from them. But in the meantime, we also need to take charge of the existing political economy and move towards new political economies with some ability to adapt and maintain the infrastructures and correct the infrastructures. To me, Fukushima is a kind of example of a place where we need a lot of attention, concerted attention on a large scale.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I mean, I don't want to throw everything out, but what my solution is gradualism. I call it gradualism. What we do is, as we form these communities, we also create a political party. I want to call it the Gardener Party. You can pick a name, but the Gardener Party, again, is going to promote self-sufficiency locally, because the most powerful solution to eco problems is the local creation of everything, because it's the shipping actually that's doing more damage to the planet when it comes to the release of toxins into the air than anything. 90,000 ships, 15 of these ships, these big transport ships that have these huge containers on them, and they send 5,000 at one shot. 15 of those create as much pollution as all the cars on the planet, because they're running bunker fuel. There's no regulation. They're running international water. So the whole institution of shipping is unbelievably bad for the planet. So we have to create self-sufficiency in countries and locally as much as possible. But when it comes to creating cooperation between different new societies, it can be created completely on need and the need for it. Like when you think of the issue of the internet and the fact that everybody benefits from it, well, it's a great way of exchanging information and meeting people who can be useful to you in your community. We definitely want to keep the internet, and certainly some level of computer manufacturing. Things like the eco problems, well, you create communities that will specialize in that. Hopefully we can convince the military to, instead of fighting wars with other countries to start fighting wars against the equal killers of the planet killers, like things like Fukushima, things like nuclear waste, things like all the toxic waste dumps everywhere. This would be a much better use of military than what we're.
Yeah, well, how to get control of military, that to me would be the prime issue of the moment, because the military is doing, extraordinary. You talk about civil transport doing damage. Well, can you imagine, even the secret things we don't know about, the new research done in, nuclear weaponry, small weapons. There are nuclear weapons being used now,
Yes,
tactical weapons that we don't, and they don't tell us. They, during the Cold War, the idea was mutually assured destruction. These bombs are so big that they can't be used. So the Dr. Strangeloves put their minds to work to think, well, how can we evolve the technology to use it? And this is where, I would say, for instance, 9/11, as long as we have this lie empowering the military, empowering the police, empowering the central governments, empowering the most corrupt, manipulable type of politician, the media being, so absorbed into this structure of keeping these lies alive. So here's, we could argue about what's the priority of things, and people might say, well, 9/11 happened a long time ago, and the whole interpretation of what happened in World War II, and these Holocaust museums all over the place, creating this structure. Well, if you criticize Israel, somehow you're doing something that somehow invokes these earlier crimes. I mean, this illusionary world that supports this cancerous, cannibalistic structure of power right now. This is where these agendas for bringing about, more ecological, nature-based societies, more power to you. Yes, let's do that. But to get to a position where we can start to deal with the real crises we face, which are environmental, which are ecological, and they're psychological, because people are being driven crazy. I mean, there is an agenda to contaminate the mental environment, to disorient people, to put us in a position of perpetual angst and fear of one another, and to divide us. So this truth movement, the idea that, well, truth is pretty important, and we don't see much truth in our televisions, in our newspapers. Our universities are quite deeply implicated in the misrepresentation of what is really going on, the presentation of illusion to keep alive and keep out of trouble these cabals, these elite groups. And it all goes back to the banking system and this system of fiat currency and just compounding debt that enslaves us all. So how we picture, how we develop our priorities and how to get to a position where we can deal with what really ails us, that we're killing the planet, that the life support systems that are not nature-based, that our political economy is killing, the life support system that most of us are dependent upon, the jobs, the corporations, the structure of taxes and services and such, that this structure that gives us our life in the short term is annihilating life on the planet. And this has got to create a tremendous mental angst, on some level, especially subconscious levels, I imagine. So the truth movement to me is very important.
Yeah, well, that would be part of the mandate of like this new political party I'm calling the Gardner Party. It would be one of the core elements would be to centralize the power. Another one would be to create a green currency, and just like we have a Bitcoin, we could create a green currency, and we could create our own banking system, and it would be I call it a currency with a conscience. And we basically would use the money that's circulated to create a banking system, and then we would use the money to fix the planet. If we have to buy back the land, enough land to sustain it, we'll do that. If we have to, create lots of eco-villages, we'll do that. I mean, it would just depend on how we wanted to structure it. But there are a lot of alternative currencies out there now, and I've actually talked to some very bright people who have been looking at these issues all their lives, and so there's a lot of discussion going on in very progressive circles on the issue of alternative currency. But through the creation of this Gardner Party, we could get out the message of the truther movement that, hey, I'll tell you something that's really surprised me is that I'm one of the reasons I'm here, or the main reason I'm here now in Quebec City and not home, is that my son's on a ski team. And he's 13, but most of his ski team is like they're in high school. And I'm shocked at how smart these kids are, how aware they are. We're having a discussion about does Black Lives Matter? Is that a real organization? Is CO2 a real problem? These kids are aware of some of these. I'm just shocked that they know this stuff, and they are actually learning this stuff, not just in school, but actually they're very tuned into the alternative media. So the fact that there are young kids knowing about this stuff, it leads me to believe that there's a lot of adults too that know this stuff, and that if we get a fresh voice in the political mainstream, but a real strong alternative voice, that we could actually create some serious momentum to address the ecology, returning to nature, getting us out of the military-industrial complex. Someday I'll tell you the story about my bid back in about 35 years ago when I was writing my master's thesis on the military-industrial complex. And I met with a lot of powerful people at the time, union leaders, student leaders, government people, and they all understood the fact that we were part of a military-industrial complex, but because it was making us lots of money, they weren't too concerned about it. But unfortunately, things have gotten a lot worse since my warning went out. So I think people are starting to think twice about, being a part of this complex, and that, our children don't have a future. And I think people are starting to see it more clearly now.
Well, with our computer systems, we could have tens of thousands of distinct, unique political economies. And that's how I see the way ahead, of course, Indigenous peoples would adapt to the specific conditions of bioregions, the combination of plants and animals, and how the synergistic forces between all these different creatures, families of life, how they interact, and then humans come in there and work out something that is part of this cycle, and every part of the earth is a different ecosystem, so there has to be unique human adaptations to each system, and that would involve creating a type of currency, a type of political economy. There could be many political economies. And of course, historically, the history of humanity is many distinct political economies and trade taking place, and some mutually beneficial trade.
Yeah,
and of course, what we then had was this particular system coming out of Europe, coming out of the banking system of Europe. And and then there was a period where there was a competing system, the Soviet-based socialist system or communist system, and then suddenly that was gone, and now you have the whole world and all human beings on the planet being incorporated in this single system, political economy. This, I guess the word for it would be capitalism, but since the bailouts of 2008, it's very clear it's not capitalism, it's socialism at the top, and ruthless competition at the bottom. The those who control the system, they want monopolies. They conspire among themselves. They protect one another. There may be some conflicts at the top, but it's basically a socialist system at the top, and every man or woman for himself or herself lower down. And this single system, what's the future of it? It thrives on debt. You've got to have continually compounding debt, and there's no plan to get out of the debt. The debt has to increase and increase, and so we need to get out of that. And I could picture with there's the Bitcoin, but that's just one system. There could be many systems, and there could be interchangeability between these distinct political economies and these distinct peoples. And this is how I picture the fourth world. One of my books is called The American Empire in the Fourth World. And the fourth world came up, it was actually a Canadian Indian by the name of George Manuel who wrote a book called The Fourth World. He picked up the term among indigenous peoples in Africa, and the idea for a time was, well, the third world people, the underdeveloped people, they have to choose between capitalism or socialism, the US-centered system or the Soviet system. And people in that context said, well, to heck with that. We shouldn't be faced with this false choice. We have our own indigenous systems, our own ways of relating to Mother Earth, to relating to ecology, to one another, to the rivers, to the plants, and we want to do modern technology, and we want to get out of this picture that we're underdeveloped, but we will go forward based on our own Aboriginal priorities and develop as fourth world peoples. And this was very much involved with the non-aligned movement, which still exists. The vast number of countries that were once colonies that became, nominally self-governing, but they were set up. There were dictatorships set up, usually by the capitalist system to take care of the resources for the multinational companies and such. But the Soviets too had their empire of sorts. So this fourth world idea of pluralism, of diversity, of indigenous peoples expressing this diversity. At the same time, we're more the same than different, and embracing the complexity of the human form and the cultural inheritances, and the fact that 6,000 languages are still spoken on the earth, and these languages are often repositories for understanding of the natural ecological relationships in the territories of these languages. These languages are living resources. They shouldn't be allowed to disappear. In Canada, there's 53 of these Aboriginal languages. So I'm very much in tune, I think, with your concept of diversity of political economies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a natural principle in everything. Look at everybody; it looks different. I mean, just at the very superficial level, whatever forces are creating, we don't have to get into teleological, metaphysical debates. Whatever force is forming this planet we live on, it's into diversity. It's a core organizing principle.
And then when we, and then but the capitalist system wants to make monocultures.
Oh God!
So you create you remove old growth forests with all their diversity, and you replace it with tree farms and monocultures, and then say a virus or some bacteria beastie comes along, some plague. Well, they're all cousins, in this forest, and if there's a vulnerability to this new arrival, some kind of virus or bacteria, they'll all get sick and they'll all die off. So, biodiversity is a way that nature is able to adapt and cope, and I think it's the same with human beings. If we're all coming out of a single school system with single way of understanding and a simple and a core curriculum, say, that makes us all similar, this is not healthy, and this does not create a system where there's adaptive capacities, that whatever problem arises, we'll have people looking at the problem from a variety of perspectives, with a variety of backgrounds, with cultural pluralism to go along with the biodiversity. I mean, this is the way I've pictured it over the years.
No, yeah, no, it's a beautiful vision of a much better world, and actually the way the world used to be organized.
Yeah, and so
years ago maybe.
Yeah, but really the idea that there's one uniform